Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this afternoon's Buckley Institute programming. My name is William Barbie, and I'm the events director of the William F. Buckley Jr. program here at Yale. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all to this afternoon's event featuring Commissioner Manny Diaz, Dr. Lindsey Burke, and Mr. Robert Pondiscio. Before we proceed, I would like to say a few words about the Buckley program and the format of today's event. The William F. Buckley Jr. program is the flagship program of the Buckley Institute, an organization dedicated to promoting intellectual diversity and open political discussion at Yale. We have hosted lectures, dinner seminars, firing line debates, and an annual conference every year since 2011. Our over 550 Buckley Fellows hold a wide range of political beliefs, but they all stand united against the formation of a liberal-only echo chamber on campus. By providing Yale students with a forum to engage meaningfully with serious, conservative thought, the Buckley program has become an institution on Yale's campus and a symbol for a more open and representative political atmosphere. Especially at a university where the mission is the cultivation and creation of new knowledge, Buckley Fellows believe that all perspectives must be heard and examined in good faith. You can learn more about the program and how to become a fellow on our website at buckleyinstitute.com. For today's event, after introducing our guests, I'll turn things over to them, and after their remarks, we'll open the floor for questions from the audience. Now for our speakers. Florida Education Commissioner Manny Diaz Jr. is a lifelong educator, having begun his career in education teaching social studies and coaching baseball in the Miami-Dade County Public School System in 1994. He then served as an assistant principal from 2007 to 2013 until becoming the chief operating officer at Doral College. He was appointed Commissioner of Education by the Florida State Board of Education effective June 1, 2022. He served with distinction in the Florida State Legislature, originally elected to the Florida House of Representatives in 2012, where he quickly became known as an expert and champion of education. Dr. Lindsey Burke is the director of the Center for Education Policy at the Heritage Foundation, where she oversees Heritage's research and policy on issues pertaining to preschool, K-12, and higher education reform. In 2021, Burke was tapped to join Governor-elect Glenn Youngkin's Transition Steering Committee and was also appointed to serve on the Youngkin Landing Team for Education. Burke was also appointed by Governor Youngkin to serve on the Board of Visitors for George Mason University. Her term runs from July 1st, 2022 to June 30th, 2026. Burke also serves as a fellow at EdChoice, the namesake foundation of Milton and Rose Friedman, and on the boards of several other education-focused nonprofits. And finally, Robert Pondiscio is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on K-12 education, curriculum, teaching, school choice, and charter schooling. Before joining AEI, Mr. Pondiscio was a policy analyst and education reform expert at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, an education policy think tank. Mr. Pondiscio became interested in education policy issues when he started teaching 5th grade at a struggling South Bronx public school in 2002. Before that, he worked in journalism for over 20 years. Without further ado, I hope you'll all join me in welcoming Commissioner Diaz, Dr. Burke, and Mr. Pondiscio to the Buckley program and to Yale.
You want me to go start or ladies first? We'll go ladies first.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you. Well, thank you for having me. Thanks to the Buckley program for having me and for all of you for being here. It's really an honor to be here. Excited to talk to you all today about what I really think was maybe perceived as a pretty sleepy issue a few years ago and is maybe one of the hottest policy issues out there today. K-12 education, really all the way through higher education, but our focus tonight is on K-12, and so much of the cultural debates that are consuming our national dialogue are taking place in America's schools, and that is fundamentally a reflection of the fact that public schools are not values-neutral institutions. And so I think there's a lot that we can tease out tonight around that idea. But just to back up a bit, I'm Lindsey Burke. As was said, I have been at the Heritage Foundation now for about 15 years, overseeing our education policy work there. Came by way, really brief stint teaching high school French, and then after that, coming to Heritage, and was really pleased to work with Governor Youngkin's team during his transition, and have been working over the past year or year and a half now on seeing higher ed policy in particular put into practice in my role as a board member at the largest university in the state of Virginia. So that's been a really good experience as well, seeing on the ground a lot of the ideas that we work to champion every day really come to fruition. From a conservative public policy perspective, at least from the Heritage perspective, and I think Robert will likely talk a little bit about maybe how AEI might see things slightly differently or pretty similarly to where Heritage is, but our goal, I think, really fits into two buckets, has two parts. The first is limiting federal intervention in education, so reducing Washington's role in K-12 education in particular. You should know, if you don't already, that it is not an enumerated power of the federal government. Education isn't. That education, federal financing of education is a very small share of our overall K-12 financing. It's about 8.5% of all K-12 education spending. And yet the rules and red tape far exceed that 8.5% financing share. So working to limit Washington's intervention in local school districts in order to right-size that financing share. And then the second piece is advancing education freedom broadly. Largely that takes a state and local level focus, largely a state focus. So we'll get into this much more, but advancing school choice. And this has been, I cannot overstate what a phenomenal year and a half it has been for school choice. If you follow it even on the periphery, you know that it is unrivaled, the moment that we're in terms of empowering families with the ability to select into learning environments that align with their values. So I'll stop there and hand it over to the commissioner.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm just thankful for the Buckley Institute for the work you do and for putting on these events, having the opportunity to interact and share different views. And I'm really honored to share this on this panel with these two experts who really have been doing this work and digging into policy. I started my policy work after leaving as a practitioner in education, as a teacher and assistant principal, getting elected to the Florida House in 2012, where I served as both the chair of the Choice and Innovation in Education Committee and also the Appropriations Chair for K-12 education before going on to the Senate, where I chaired the Education Policy Committee. So I've had the opportunity to operate in writing policy, and it's a very few people who get the opportunity that I'm so fortunate to have right now, is to be picked to be able to have the operational implementation of those policies. So, you know, when you're doing that, you got to be careful what you're cooking in the kitchen, because you're going to have to later on, if you're implementing, eat those policies. And it's easy when you're in the legislature to put things into place that then are a burden on the agency, right? And then when you go run the agency, you realize how much work and how difficult implementation is. But very excited time in education. The thing that excites me the most is from the time I got elected in 2012 until recently, probably the COVID years, I was always banging the drum talking about parents paying attention, folks paying attention to what was going on in education. But it was such a sleepy issue. People kind of just took it for granted. They had their neighborhood school. They were okay with that. They weren't really paying attention to what was going on in schools until kids started to go to school on their dining room tables, and parents started to realize what was going on, and not just from a content perspective, but also from a timing perspective. How much time during a 7-day school day is actually invested in teaching and learning, and how much time is maybe wasted. Along with that, I had the opportunity to work on a lot of school choice policy along the years. I wrote the bill and sponsored the bill that created the Family Empowerment Scholarship in Florida in 2019, which just this past year was expanded to total universal choice, where in the state of Florida, all students, all parents, regardless of zip code, background, income, have the opportunity to choose the setting for their students. And there's a lot of nuances within that. I'm not going to get into the details, because we have several programs within that are nuanced, unique abilities and things of that nature. But it's very exciting to do that. And I think I'd say one of the biggest challenges that we have, and you mentioned it, Lindsey, is to bring back the basics of education, right? Of getting our students to really focus in where we have a national problem in this country of students not being proficient in reading, right? We have a national problem of students not being up to par in math, but we're paying attention to so many other bells and whistles. We need to figure out how to get that back to the point where we're really involved in teaching and learning, and allow families and parents to handle other issues that come up at the right time and kind of get that train back on the track. So I think it is an exciting time because so many people are involved, because there's so many debates, and that to me is at the end of the day how you produce the best results.
And because of your reforms, if I could just say, Florida ranks #1 as of last year on the Heritage Foundation's Education Freedom Report Card. So just phenomenal work in Florida.
Thank you.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Robert Pondiscio. Grateful to the Buckley program for having me. A little surprised that you're having me, honestly. I was a B student in my comprehensive high school on Long Island years and years ago. I took a semester off from a state school during the middle of my sophomore year. They're still holding my room, as far as I know. I never quite found my way back. So finding myself at AEI and at Yale to discuss education policy, suffice it to say, I've kind of outkicked my coverage. And I'm grateful to you all for having me. Quick show of hands. How many people in this room attended as kids, you were a geographically zoned public school, meaning like this is where I live, this is where I go to school, okay? Any private school graduates here, all right? So a little overrepresented nationally. How about any charter school? Oh, okay, more and more you see those hands going up. For decades, the dominant paradigm in American education is that this is where I live, this is where I go to school, and you don't think very much about it whatsoever. Question for you. What percentage, if you were to guess, what percentage of K-12 students today are doing something other than that? In other words, where for decades, 90% of kids went to geographically zoned public schools. What's the percentage today? Anybody? Okay. Higher, is that too high or too low? Too high. Okay, it's actually 41%. And let me define that. In other words, that is anything other than this is where I live, this is where I go to school. So it could be private, religious, Catholic. It could be homeschooling. It could be a magnet school. It could be a public district where there's open enrollment, so I'm still in a public school, but I got to choose my public school. So that's 4 out of 10 kids are doing something other than this cultural habit that we have had for just many, many decades, including me. I mean, I never, if you'd said to me private school as a kid growing up in Long Island, I'd have assumed you meant Catholic school. That's all I knew. If you'd said to me boarding school, I would have said, what did you do? Why are they sending you away? My dad was forever threatening to send me to military academy, and I kind of wish he had sometimes. And those numbers are going to grow. I'm not sure if you, I can't recall if you alluded to this or not, Lindsey, but in at least, what is it, 9 states now?
Yes.
As of last week, North Carolina
Yep.
became the 9th state
right.
in this country to institute a so-called universal ESA, which broadly speaking means if a parent wants to opt out of the public school system altogether, the state will say, okay, here's the money, or most of the money, 80, 90% of the money, go buy yourself some education. You know, pay tuition in private school, hire tutors, etc. So that 41% figure, I think, see me back here in 5 or 10 years and see if I'm right about this, we are very quickly approaching the day where that dominant paradigm, this is where I live, this is where I go to school, is going to be the majority or the plurality. But half of all kids in this country will do something other than what they have done for many, many decades. That's extraordinary. So when I talk about, when people ask me what's the big story in education right now, I say, well, it's in play, and that's the phrase I use.
Yeah.
Americans' relationship to public education, to education at large, is in play in a way in which I think, do you agree, would have been unimaginable just a few years ago. Where we're getting to that tipping point where half of kids are going to be doing something other than that. So that's one thing. What's driving this? I think it's being driven largely by a crisis of confidence, a crisis of faith and trust in this institution. And as Commissioner Diaz alluded to, COVID is probably the big obvious mover there. Look, public schools, I always remind my teacher colleagues this, you know, public schools are a basic bedrock government function. When they become unavailable, for a large stretch of time. Remember, 2 weeks to flatten the curve became a whole, 2 years, and in some places parts of a third year. And even now, there's some quarantining going on. When that bedrock service that parents rely upon just becomes unreliable, what happens? They make other plans. They discover online schools, homeschools. They take the money and they go to private schools and whatnot. So there's this big crisis of confidence. Commissioner Diaz also alluded to, and by the way, my background, these folks are policy, especially Lindsey, is a policy expert. I pretend to be a policy guy. At the end of the day, I'm mostly a practice person. I'm the weirdo who says, can we talk about what the kids do in school all day? Can we talk about curriculum and instruction? Charters, choice, assessment, that's good, but I want to talk about what the content is. So what happened? For years, I've lamented the so-called black box of the American classroom, because you measure what goes in, you measure what comes out, and you assume that it's all the same. When the gods want to punish you, they answer your prayers. That black box was ripped open, and now it was on every living room or every kitchen table in America for a year. A lot of teachers looked good with that. A lot did not. It really affected that issue of trust. When you're seeing what your child is getting day after day after day, there's no more. The kimono is open, so to speak. So that's probably what's driving a lot of this. I'm a choice guy. I wouldn't be sitting here in this room. The Buckley program really wouldn't have invited me if I was not. So I'm actually okay with all this, right? I'm more than okay. This is what I wanted. This is exactly what I wanted. I wanted the students that I had, and just by way of background, when I was teaching in the South Bronx, 4 out of 5 of my 5th graders were reading and doing math below grade level. The school that I taught in, PS 277, if you know New York City, it's divided into school districts. So my school was in District 7, which is the lowest, was then and now still the lowest scoring district in New York City. My school, then and now, 20 years later, the lowest scoring school in District 7. So literally the worst of the worst. So why am I a choice guy? That's why I'm a choice guy, because generation after generation is stuck in that school and it's not getting any better. So I'm happy, right? There's a but coming. As Lindsey knows, I'm the skunk at every picnic I get invited to, including the ones that I throw myself. So what makes me nervous about this? And I don't want to overstate this, because I really do think that choice is good, and I'm excited about the dynamism that could come into education through broader choice. But I'm also an American, okay? I've done a lot of work over the years for a guy named E.D. Hirsch Jr. of cultural literacy and core knowledge fame. Very much a man of the left, but very much by his own description an educational conservative. This is the guy, if you've ever been in Barnes & Noble or Borders, we don't have Borders anymore, and seen those books, what your first grader needs to know, what your second grader needs to know. I'm seeing nodding heads, you know those books. That's his work. His work is my work. So why am I concerned about this? I'm shedding no tears whatsoever for the common school. Horace Mann, 200 years ago, what was his famous phrase about that? Not the great equalizer in America. It hasn't worked, okay? Those kids, my former 5th graders, are not full participants. They're not as upwardly mobile as they could be because they didn't get a good education. They should be in, some of those kids should be in this room, and they will never be in this room because of the education that they got. So the common school experiment, if you like, didn't work. That's not what I'm worried about. I'm worried about losing the common school ideal. In other words, what are the things that unite us as Americans? What is the body of knowledge that we all know? Hirsch, if he were here, would tell you, well, look, if we don't deal with the same amount of background knowledge, allusions, idiomatic language, vocabulary, we're literally speaking different languages. So I'm thrilled about our current choice situation, but in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, okay, now comes the hard part. Now those of us who have been choice advocates, now we have to do the service after the sale. And now we have to make sure that for the kids for the non-choosers, so to speak, the kids who will still be in the school that I was in, that they're being taken care of as well. So I'm all for choice, but I'm a little bit tiny bit nervous. I'm always, it's just who I am. But I want to make sure that choice actually solves the problem that I think it's going to solve and doesn't actually make it worse.
I reassure Robert of something really quick here. So I think, to your point, it just sparks something, so I figure I'm just going to jump in. What we have seen in Florida is by pushing this and by disrupting, and I can tell you because I spent 17 years inside the public school system as a teacher and administrator, captive in there and was frustrated by several things. Something that nobody probably thinks about, right, when you're thinking about a school is customer service, right? Parent comes in, nobody's paying attention to the parent, sit there, wait, somebody will get to you sooner or later, right? That dynamic has been completely smashed by school choice. And what we have seen in Florida, Miami-Dade County, our largest county, incredibly diverse people from all over the world, all kinds of languages, right? It has 70% of our kids there go to a choice school. Choice doesn't mean that it's private. Choice doesn't mean that it's charter. Choice means it's something other than their zone school. The district figured out that they needed to compete with first the charters, which was the first healthy ecosystem in Florida, and then now the ESAs and the vouchers, and they have incredibly stepped up their game. So to answer your question about what happens next, I think there's a model right there is do you raise the bar in order to create a better product so that that student, that parent's not leaving that school system and that you're continually raising the bar.
And I'm going to just give a yes, but I agree with everything he said. And I spent a week in Arizona earlier this year, which has had open enrollment for 30 years. So there's literally not a teacher or administrator in that state who has spent a day outside of a system where they have to compete for students. So I completely agree with you. But I mentioned I'm a practice guy and I'm concerned about curriculum and instruction. You got to focus on that too. In other words, what choice can't be is the best possible delivery system of the worst possible product. We still have, I joke about this all the time, that if you sent a lot of people in the ed reform world that I come out of back in time to fix the EDSL, you know, they would, and do you know what the EDSL is, young people? Okay. You know, they would close down plants that made lousy EDSLs. They would give more money to the line workers who were making the EDSLs that sold the best, but they'd still make EDSLs. As opposed to
sounds like the public system.
Well, yes, no.
So the point, I mean, so NAEP civic scores.
Sure. Oh my God.
They're terrible.
Don't even.
So I don't disagree, but it begs the question: is the government model the best way to get robust civic unity?
No, it's not. And I'm not going to belabor the point and divert the conversation.
No, it said debate on the invite, so we should have a debate.
Well, I'm not debating with people who I agree with.
You could go back to the whole the definition that I think is been driven away from its original intent is what is public education, right? The education was no one ever said at the beginning, right, that it had to be produced or given by the government.
Right.
It was for the public, and how you got that account was community based and all of that. But I mean, I don't want to stomp all over the moderators. So.
And one last point. I got surprisingly far into this work before it dawned on me that the way we do public education in this country, where the government both funds and runs, we're the outlier.
Yeah.
Most of the rest of the world, the government funds but does not necessarily run. There's in other countries, they're far more what they call pluralistic, where you may go to a religious school or a private school, but it's still government funded. The one wrinkle there, as a curriculum guy, is most other countries tend to have national curriculums, which we will never have in this country because of the enumerated powers that Dr. Burke described a moment ago, that pesky Constitution.
Yeah, sorry, we will hand it back to you, but just to your point, I mean, this was the Milton Friedman argument circa 1955 when he wrote The Role of Government in Education, was just because you have the public financing of education, that does not mean you need government delivery of services. So separate the financing from the delivery, which is what eventually became known as a school voucher, and now a more refined version of that voucher in the education savings account model that Robert discussed.
Oh, well, thank you all for your opening remarks and brief discussion. I think I'd like to ask a question or two before we turn it over to the audience. And my first one is related to something that you mentioned, Dr. Burke, earlier about that we're seeking to create value-neutral education in our public schools?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no way you can create values-neutral. So my point is that public schools are not values-neutral places.
I see. And so I guess my question would be, what does that look like to create a public school system in which the values are appropriate and applicable for an entire American population, right? Because that's kind of the big discussion today is what values do we want to be promoting in schools? A lot of parents would say, school is where I want my kid to grow up to be an upright American citizen. But then there's a lot of parents who also say, we're not so big fans of America anyway, so we might want to, change the system a little bit.
Yeah, and I don't think you can, to be honest, create what you just described, because as long as you have what Robert described, which is compulsory education that is assigned, it is forced, taxpayer funding, it's publicly funded, it's compelled, and it's assigned. That iron triangle of regulatory capture of K-12 education, as long as you have that, you're always going to have contested debates about the content that is taught in those schools. So absent, and I am a school choice purist, absent a robust landscape of education choice, you're always going to have those debates within the public system about whose values they will be. There was actually one of Robert's, I think, former colleagues, Grant Addison, he put it best in an article recently where he said the big question right now animating K-12 education is, if I want to get it right, what do we want the next generation of Americans to think about America? And I think that's it. That's the question. And so, in a government-assigned, compulsory, publicly financed system of near monopoly education, who's going to make that decision? It's always going to be fraught. So we have to enable families, fund them directly. Yes, publicly finance education, but fund the child directly and allow them to select into learning environments that reflect their values. And all of the rigorous research that has been produced today on the issue shows that when you have robust systems of choice, you actually have improved civic outcomes as well. So I do think it would lead eventually to greater levels of civic knowledge and potentially unity. And to Commissioner Diaz's point, isn't Miami thinking about adopting a classical curriculum?
As a matter of
So that
fact,
competitive-
they have. So what they've adopted is they've adopted a classical model school, and what they're going to do to make sure that nobody's forced to do it, to make sure it's a choice, is they've decided to convert an elementary school into a classical model, and it's a magnet school. And so it's open enrollment. There's no one in that zone is forced to go to that model. That model is clearly not for everyone, but they've delved into something that in Florida has become a huge movement. And I think, as you mentioned that, and going back to what you're asking is, from the parents' perspective, there are some things that families envision and are demanding, and that classical model is providing that for certain families, right? There's a different way of learning. It certainly requires a larger commitment from even the families to be involved in the classical model for the student to be successful. I think it's clearly a more in-depth education instead of shallow, right, and long. It's deeper. It can be harder for a student who's transitioning from a traditional or regular education. But I think, going back to your point, that's just one example of where, and that's what we've done in Florida, is tried to provide that choice for parents. But look, I would argue something that has to be maintained at the end of the day. People could have different opinions or even values, but at the end of the day, if your schools are being funded by America, right, and you live in America, we all live under the Constitution, you do have the responsibility to teach the basic tenets. In other words, students should understand what the Constitution is. When did that just become political? That's our form of government. Students should understand that there's 3 branches of government. Students should understand at their state level, which probably affects their lives more than anything the federal government will do, that there are 3 branches, and how the judicial system works, right? And how the local government works. Because again, as soon as you own a property and you start paying property taxes, you're going to figure out where that local government is really quickly. So those basic tenets of understanding not only the formation of the country, but the system of government that we live under, I think, I don't know where there's a value argument against that. I don't think that's a value. I think that's our system of government and where we live. And so there are folks that are willing to have that debate. I will stand on the side of saying we're all responsible for that, and that doesn't mean that that's going to determine your political lens one way or another. But it is a fact that we have a constitution. It is a fact that we are a constitutional republic. Sure. Those are facts that we have to understand. And I think for decades, we have clearly failed kids in having the basic understanding of that. And going to just when you have a clip of someone on the street with a microphone asking somebody on the street what, name, how many branches of government we've had, name a president. I mean, those things to me are not political or value based. When you start talking about the value argument, I would say, and this is just, again, this is my perspective, is again, going back to basics. We have students that are struggling, a great number of students struggling to read proficiently on grade level at 3rd grade, which we know marks so many things in life, right? We have an issue with math where we're falling behind, and science, we're falling behind the rest of the world, but we're paying attention to so many other things in school. And so if that's not the basic function, if we can't learn to read so that we can read to learn, and we can't do at least the basic math required to move on, that is, I think, you go back to the crux of the issue, it comes down to the basics. And so you can argue about values all you want. That's the function of our education system is to have productive members of society who can function and uphold the republic. Well, if you can't read, you can't uphold the republic.
It goes even further back than that, and I'm a former high school civics teacher. That was my second gig, so I'm in violent agreement on the need for civic education. And I'm also fond of pointing out that Horace Mann went to his grave without ever having once uttered the phrase college and career ready. Never said it once. The founding purpose of American public education was preparation for citizenship. In other words, republics don't have a good history. There's factions, they fall apart. Our earliest writers about public education, or before there was a public education system, our founders were very, very concerned about, the old Franklin line about a republic, madam, if you can keep it. It was a big, big ask of ordinary men, and at the time it was, yes, of course, just men, to keep it. So we have a public education system for that reason, to create educated men and now women to maintain the republic. The values question is fascinating to me, however, because, and this is another argument for choice. Sorry, I'm free associating here a little bit, but and remember, I'm a curriculum guy. I want every American citizen to have the same basic mental storehouse of furniture. About 5 or 6 years ago, Colin Kaepernick got Nike to pull a sneaker off the market that had the Betsy Ross, the 1776, the circle star. And I remember writing a piece in Education Week at the time in which I had to concede a country that cannot agree whether its rock bottom basic iconography is a symbol of pride or oppression is just not a country that is ready to agree on what their kids should learn in school all day. I mean, so you're wondering what about the values question? Well, there it is. It couldn't be in sharper relief. When we don't agree on that, then it's foolish to think that we're going to have a system of education that we are all going to hold hands and sing Kumbaya and agree what our kids should know. It's just that train has left the station.
So just a brief sort of follow-up. You obviously all believe that Americans in the public school system should be educated about the information and the facts about America. Do you think that the public school system should make people proud to be American?
I'll jump in on that. I think yes. And this gets me in trouble, maybe not in this room, but in other rooms. It'll surprise you to learn on other college campuses. This is not a popular opinion. Commissioner, you alluded to it a moment ago. Who pays for our public schools? We do, the government. The idea, and again, I'm speaking as a classroom teacher, I don't think I'm overstating the case to say that public education has become increasingly estranged from its public purpose. In other words, it tends to see its role more as critiquing American life than attaching students to American life. Look, I was a former journalist. I don't want to give anybody the idea that I want kids to see our country through rose-colored glasses. When I'm talking about civics, I always say, look, you could have a really good education in civics by on the first day of school reading the preamble to the Constitution and that language about in order to form a more perfect union. And the rest of your education is where do we succeed, where do we meet it, where do we still have work to go. That's a clear-eyed vision of all this. But we are, at the end of the day, I reflect on my own experience as a teacher. I was told I needed to be an agent of change. I needed to teach for social justice. Nobody said to me what in retrospect seemed like something I should have heard pretty early on. Hey, Pondiscio, you're a public servant. You're a state actor. You're an adult with tremendous influence over a captive audience of other people's children. You need to be humble. This is not your performance space. You don't get to bring your priors in here. Right. And I think we've drifted so far away from that professional ethic that I think should form the core of what we do in this work.
And I think that's where the big clash is. So then when like states like Florida pass policies to try to prevent that, their narrative becomes Florida's politicizing education. Yeah. No, what we're trying to do is depoliticize education and bring it back. But I do think that those basic tenets, and I completely agree with you, those basic tenets are, yes, we are imperfect. Yes, we've had horrific things happen in our history, just like every other place in the world has had them. And while not being perfect, the continuous striving to be perfect, where does that responsibility ultimately fall? It falls on the next generation. And if you're not educating them on how we started, what we went through, how we got here, and the ways we still have to go, then how's the next generation supposed to pick up the mantle of the original idea and improve on it?
How are we encouraging students to even be invested to take the work up?
Right, correct.
With that, I think we'd like to turn it over to you all. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to bring over the microphone. You, sir?
So in Florida, of course, there's been a lot of controversy in which.
Are you able to stand up, sir?
I'm to stand up. In Florida, there's been a lot of controversy. Disney opposed efforts by Florida to restrict what could be taught to young children about sexual issues, and I'm sure there's a lot of other legislation or rules about curriculum in Florida, but if you're in a private school, or you're not in the public school, are they bound? Does Florida still seek to require them to follow these rules, or are those other school choice locations free to do their own thing?
In the state of Florida, the standards, which is what you're referring to, because that applied to the standards of what's taught in our public schools, that was affected by that bill. We do not dictate the standards or the curriculum of our private schools. So it is where that is embedded. And again, you have to remember when you read something in the media, you're hearing it from afar. This is actually a conversation about standards that got turned into a conversation about a whole social issue or what you can and cannot say, and then exploded and turned it into something whole other that involved Disney. But at the reality, the base of it, where you're talking about is standards. And I do think, and I stand by, a sovereign state should be able to determine what's in its public school standards. And that's basically what that conversation was about, turned into something else, obviously.
Hi, Robert, you mentioned that you were working at the worst of the worst public school in New York, and that was what made you an advocate for school choice. And this question can go to you or to anybody. Is it possible that the kids in that school are just different kind of kids, and sending them to another school is not going to work? Is there any evidence that suggests that switching the school actually makes a difference for those kids?
This is anecdote, this is journalism, not data, okay? So a few years ago, I wrote a book about a very successful network of charter schools in the same neighborhood. I spent a year embedded in a Success Academy school, which was literally across the street from where I'd been a student teacher and a few blocks away from where I'd been teaching fifth grade. And the reason I wanted to write this book was basically to answer exactly that question. You know, the theory behind charter schools is and we say in New York City, where I come from, you hear this all the time because charter schools are often co-located in the same building. So you hear a lot of rhetoric about the kid goes in this door, they get a bad outcome. The kid goes in that door, they get a good outcome. We don't have time to unpack this. It's a complicated story. It's a lot more complicated than just which door they go into. A lot of it has to do with parental engagement. A lot of it has to do with school culture. A lot of it has to do with teacher expectations and adult culture in a school. But the moral of the story was if those charter schools had existed when I was teaching fifth grade 20 years ago, I could almost guarantee you, I could tell you who were the kids who would be the first out the door to go. Would they have gotten a better outcome? No question. Would some of them be in this room? No question. Would this make it more difficult in the school that they left behind? Yeah. And I don't think others are going to tell you that, but I'm going to tell you that. I know what the data says. I know the data says it creates a rising tide that lifts all boats. And then I think of what it'll be like to have those kids not there as a teacher. That makes my job harder. So there's not a good answer, is the moral of the story. But I come back to when I wrote this book, There was a quote in the book from Charles Murray, which I debated long and hard, whether should I leave it in or take it out. And I actually I have the quote. It was something to the effect of, it is not government's job to identify the worthy, it's the government's job to protect a society in which the worthy can identify themselves. And I agree with that. Because who are we to treat those children as public resources and say, I'm sorry, you can't have what my daughter had, you can't have choice. Because again, some of those kids should be in this room, and they wouldn't be unless they had choice. But I'm not going to, by the same token, blind myself to the downstream effects of the policies that I favor.
And I would add to that, and you're probably going to jump in and add to this, but I think you go back to the philosophical difference of how you view the children, the students, right? So the teachers union and the educational establishment will tell you that they're treated as a collective. So you treat that whole school as a collective. The problem is what school choice does is, and it goes right to that quote, it says, no, each child, each student is an individual, and every one of them learn differently and require a certain setting, including in one family. You could have 4 kids, 2 of them can go to the neighborhood school, 2 of them, one can be at a private school, and 1 can be virtual. That is the difference, is that you're not dealing with widgets, you're dealing with individuals. So to answer your question, you can't answer the question to the collective. Yeah. You got to answer the question of each individual child, and that's the way I think we need to view education, because we keep just looking at it as a collective, then we're continuing to go down the same path where you have protectionism of jobs from the teachers union's perspective, right? Because they don't collect dues from the kids. They collect dues from, right? They're trying to protect jobs and job numbers. But the administrative state of school districts as well is trying to protect jobs and is always saying, just give me more money, that's going to result. At the end of the day, when you boil it down to the individual student, that's when that aha moment happens. So your question, I think I agree with Robert's answer, and just to dig a little deeper into it, is you can't ask the question as the whole. You have to ask what happens to each individual life in that school.
Yeah, I mean, to say it differently, the title of this book that I alluded to that I wrote was called How the Other Half Learns, and I chose that title deliberately because if you think about it, I had, and I'll bet most of us in this room had complete and unfettered choice, and it was unremarkable. Either you had the ability to pay for private school tuition or religious education, or your parents could pick up and move to a place with good schools. So I was struck then, I'm struck now that when you didn't, that it's for me it's unremarkable. For the kids that I was writing about, it's a crisis when somebody comes along and gives them that choice, because what about the kids who are left behind? What about the kids whose schools will be damaged by choice? Well, nobody treats my child as a public resource, so why do we think we get to treat low-income, poor black and brown kids as a public resource? They have parents. They have lives of their own.
You said data earlier, so I was just going to chime in really quickly. We've got 18 randomized controlled trial evaluations of the effect of school choice on academic outcomes, and all but only two show negative effects. Both of those were unique to a single program in Louisiana that is the most heavily regulated school choice program in the country, so much so they layered so many regulations onto this program that private schools just said, we're not going to participate, and then the private schools that did participate were already losing students prior to program entry, so they were already struggling, which we think is why we have those 2 negative evaluations, but the bulk of the RCTs show improved academic outcomes for participants and non-participants, those that stay in the public system as well.
Thank you. I have a question for you, Commissioner Diaz. When I see what's going on in Florida, I'm kind of wondering how Florida is preparing students to become educated citizens in our republic that are capable of having difficult conversations. I kind of have 2 questions for you, because when Florida banned the teaching of AP African American Studies earlier this year, you said that it was like a woke indoctrination masquerading as education. Like, this is AP education. This is for high-performing high school students in Florida, for a teaching that would teach about systemic racism. And so, one, I'm curious about how you define woke and critical race theory just in general, because I hear these words thrown around all the time. And 2, how Florida students are being prepared to participate as educated citizens in a republic when they don't when they're not able to learn about systemic racism in high school?
Well, number one, I would challenge you to look at Florida's advanced placement opportunities. And when you look at that course, you had, I would say, number one, you had about 3/4 of it, and I'm a former social studies teacher, 3/4 of it's incredibly robust curriculum, right? The content, 3/4 of the course, incredibly robust African American history, really things that students would benefit from learning. And then a whole quarter of it just goes off the rails into things that violate all our standards. Black gender queer theory. What does that have to do with African American history? It has nothing to do with it. The term systemic racism, we don't accept that in Florida, because what we're saying is each individual needs to be valued as an individual. We don't treat you as a color. We treat you as a person, as a human being. And so a lot of that is overinflated, number one, saying that our students don't have the opportunity to face that. Our students and actually our standards are more robust than that and having more difficult conversations when it comes to African American history. Talking about the Ku Klux Klan, talking about the beatdowns that occurs, the hosing downs that occurred, everything that the civil rights movement had to fight through to get to the point where they are today. That's the real conversation. The other point I will make is we're a sovereign state. The College Board doesn't, some third-party entity doesn't determine what the curriculum is in our state. We not only have a robust AP program, we have IB, we have ACE, and we have a robust dual enrollment program, which students who will stay in state automatically get those credits transferred into a state institution as a general education credit. And we also just created another species of high-performing advanced courses, which we're developing a test for, similar to ACE, IB, and AP, that is within our state, created by the #1 ranked state university system in the country. And so the opportunities for our students are incredible. What the media narrative wants to tell you, and the fact that as a state we will defend and have the right to not outsource our curriculum or our standards to a third party, doesn't eliminate any opportunities for our student. In fact, we go further and more in depth in that. And again, one example I'll give you is you hear a narrative that in Florida, the AP psychology class is not allowed, not taught. That's totally false. It is completely allowed, and we had to reiterate that several times to our districts because the AP, the College Board, came out and said, Florida's banning this course. We never took it off our course directory, never gave instructions to our districts not to offer it. And I had to write a letter to the superintendents and then write a second letter. It's telling them, you can offer the course. Don't mind what the College Board is telling you. We have not taken any action to remove that. So you got to be careful, number one, when you hear the top line, what's actually happened below the surface, and what the reality is. Our students are thriving with opportunities, and they can have conversations. But one thing is to have a conversation about what actually occurred, what the most horrific parts of our history are, what certain people or groups faced in our country, and it's a fact, right? We know all those things happen, and it has to be taught. And another thing is to assume and teach somebody to assume that just because of their background or their color of their skin or where they came from, that they are pegged to be in a certain position in life. And we don't accept that premise. We think that everyone should be treated as an individual regardless of what their background is, regardless of the color of their skin, or regardless of their zip code or their financial situation. And so having that conversation becomes hard because people don't want to accept that. They don't want to accept that you're willing to have the conversation and that you're really wanting to treat people as individuals and judge them by their character, not the color of their skin. And that's, again, a difficult conversation, but we're willing to have it.
Thank you. So I think that school choice is the best solution to, is it not on? No, it should be going. Okay, perfect. To sort of like weeding out the schools that are not performing well within states, right? And I totally agree with the points that you all were making about that. However, I think that those who are against school choice do have one valid concern, and I was wondering how advocates of school choice policy might respond to that. And that is the issue of different states being different markets that these schools are competing within for students, but these states are not necessarily competing against each other. So the level of education between states, or the quality of curriculum rather, varies widely. Like, for example, I grew up in Arizona, which is one of the worst states ranked in education, even though we have a lot of school choice. But my younger siblings actually just moved to Massachusetts. And even though I went to a charter school in Arizona, I know that the public schools there, the teachers barely graduated high school themselves. Whereas my siblings' teachers in Massachusetts have PhDs and they're high school teachers. What can school choice advocates offer to remedy that problem?
I would go as far as saying that you're going to get a different student experience, not just from state to state and district to district, but sometimes across the hall in the same school. This is, Lindsey's heard me bang on this drum for 20 years now, so I'm going to bang on it again. You know, and again, there's not going to be a national curriculum. Okay, that's off the table. We'll never, the sun will go out. It will not. It will not. It will not happen.
They tried.
Yeah.
They did try.
Well, they tried Common Core. Let's not have that conversation. But there should be some more commonality. And by the way, with respect to your sister, you said your siblings' experience here in Massachusetts, and Lindsey will be glad to hear me say this, right? The only thing that an advanced degree has been shown to raise is what?
Prices.
No, salaries.
Yeah, right.
It doesn't. There's no effect on the advanced degree. So I'm thrilled that your siblings are having a terrific experience, and I'm sorry yours wasn't as. Which school did you go to in Arizona, by the way? Okay, don't know that one. I've spent some time in it, but we have a. This is why I'm a curriculum and instruction guy, because I think I'm a choice guy because. But the market is good, but it has to be, the market has to be working on a superior product. And right now, it's what I said before, the market is still a little incurious about what kids do all day. So let's get the product right, and then the market forces that I support, you know, will have a more beneficial effect.
And I would say too, so we are still, as much progress as we've made, we're still at the very early stages of widespread education choice. And Arizona has gone leaps and bounds over the past few years, and now it is amazing to see. So Florida and Arizona are always 1 and 2 on our list of best states for education freedom, because Arizona has it all when it comes to what you can choose. But families are interested in whether they have good students, but they're more interested in whether their students are good or good people. And I think that is really driving a lot of the conversation around choice right now, is how do we enable families to raise their children according to their own values and hopes and aspirations for them. We went out to Arizona a few years ago to do some filming of families there because of the robust education choice landscape. Real quick aside, Arizona was the first state in the country to adopt an education savings account model. And so I know Robert kind of walked through it quickly before, but basically in Arizona, if you choose to exit your public school, you get 90% of what the state would have spent on your child in that public school literally deposited onto a debit card. You have 4 kids, you have 4 debit cards with their names on each of them, with your state per pupil funding on that debit card. And at that point, you can swipe it, you can pay for private school tuition, online learning, special education services and therapies, curricula, textbooks. You can roll it over year to year. You can even roll it into a college savings account. So families are doing that. So we went to film some families, and this one family had moved, to your point, from Michigan to Arizona because of Arizona's choice program. The mother had said her son was probably 8 at the time, had pretty significant special needs. She went to his school in Michigan to pick him up one day and found him under his desk, you know, hands around his knees, rocking back and forth, crying. And she said at that moment, she decided, we're out of here, we're leaving, we're moving to Arizona because of their education choice options. And so it was amazing to see this family use school choice in action, because we went to their house. They had hired a private tutor, so the little guy left his public school. They bought curricula that worked for him. They hired private tutors that were exactly tailored to his special needs. And so I watched this tutor come over to their house. She delivered, I think it was a math lesson that day, to EJ, was his name, to EJ. And once she was done doing the math lesson, EJ gives her a big hug. The mom pulls out her ESA debit card. The tutor pulls out her iPhone. She swipes the card on her iPhone and pays the tutor directly with her Arizona State public per pupil funds. I mean, to me, that's amazing. You know, they're able to completely craft an education that is perfectly tailored to what their kids need. And then just one more quick thing. There was another family, the Ashtons in Arizona, and I think they're just the best illustration of how it can work really, really well. They were some of the first adopters of Arizona's ESA program. Max entered when he was in 9th grade. It was 2011 when Arizona launched its ESA. And Max is totally blind. He's been completely blind since birth. And so in Arizona, the ESA program, the funding that you get is on a weighted scale. So if you have more significant needs, you get a base per pupil allocation. I don't like this word, but if you're just a typical student, you get a base per pupil allocation. It's probably about $7,000 now. And then if you have special needs, it's weighted and you get more money put into your account. So Max, because he was blind, got the maximum weight in his account, and he was getting about $21,000 a year then deposited into his ESA on his debit card. They were spending about $26,000 per year in the public system on him. So Max leaves, goes to his private school, Brophy Academy in Arizona, which they said was the best private school in Arizona. I don't know if it is, but they loved it. It worked really well for him. So he pays his private school tuition. He buys all of his Braille textbooks, all of his assistive technology, a talking computer, everything he needed to be successful as a blind student. They still had thousands of dollars left over every year that they rolled over. He graduates from Arizona, goes to California, enrolls in Loyola Marymount University, pays his college tuition with his leftover Arizona State K-12 per pupil money. I mean, that's amazing, right? That's how, when we say fund the child, not the physical school building, that's what you can end up having. So I know it's a long-winded answer, but I think we will see more of a competitive, long-term, I think, state pressure, state to state, to adopt those types of policies that we expect in every other aspect of American life. It's just absent largely in K-12.
It's really interesting that you're seeing families who are savvy enough to see those state-to-state differences.
Yes,
They know
exactly.
I'm leaving Michigan, I'm
They're
going to
moving
Arizona.
from state to state, and the
Yeah.
market will. The school choice is not perfect, and some of the facets of school, the charter school movement's a little bit more mature than the ESA movement. The other thing is, it depends how you view it, right? Like, it's not perfect, but sometimes it is perfect for that individual student in that family, and that's where the rub is, right? When you're comparing the whole thing, and as you talk about from state to state, there's really not a lot of comparison you can make because every state is different, and that's why it's a function of the state. You have to kind of drill down into what functions for the individual family, and how they view success for that student. And these cases are I mean, I remember the first time I heard about the Arizona program, right? We passed ours right after, but they were talking about equine therapy, and I'm thinking this is, I'm a second-year legislator, and I'm thinking, coming from a public school system, and I'm thinking, equine therapy, like, have these people lost their mind? Now the state's paying for equine, we're going to have horses for the kid? And then I started to do some research, and these students with particular cases thrive with these kind of therapies. And so we had an article written in Florida the other day about how government money was being thrown out the door, and that someone on the program, the Unique Ability Program scholarship, had purchased a 52-inch television. Well, imagine that. That was the headline. Huge. The part they didn't tell you, again, this is why I always go after the media headline, is this is a student that was visually impaired. And so the only way they could read is by having giant letters, and what other screen would you put it on? So how is that not a justified expense? But if you put that in a headline, the public outcry is you're throwing out, public dollars on televisions. So I think, look, all of this is very young. I think that the movement itself is still, even the charter school movement is only 20-something years old. So I think it's going to continue to develop. I think that the state-to-state question, what I've encountered is not the federal government mandating it, but states looking at best practices. And folks, I have colleagues in other states in my same position, and you start to have conversations and share notes. And the policies don't always work in one state as opposed to, because there's differences, right? But you start to get an idea of what forms that. But I do think that we're in an early stage of adoption and development of this. and it will eventually find its footing.
Yeah.
Perhaps one or two more questions.
Robert, I was very happy to hear you talk about E.D. Hirsch. I was on to him as soon as he wrote Cultural Literacy, and I knew that he had a great idea. And the thing that we all have to understand is that learning to decode is just the first step. The rest of your life is learning all of the types of things that he teaches in the What's Your
Would you like to come up here and give my talk? Because I talk about this all the time.
Right. And what's interesting about that is his Dictionary of Cultural Literacy, which has like over 10,000 entries that were collected by scholars in 23 subject domains. This guy, it's in his book, The Knowledge Deficit, the guy put it into a computer and matched it with the New York Times over 101 months and found out that on an average day, 2,700 of those entries appear in the New York Times. It was just scientifically confirmed. His approach is correct. And that's why we use those with my granddaughter, who I homeschool. And I write, by the way, I write SAT vocabulary building novels, so she's getting that benefit. And we also teach civics, and she could pass the citizenship test when she was in 4th grade. And I show her those videos on YouTube of people being asked about the 3 branches of government, and I say, "See, those people vote." Isn't that scary?
This is both. Again, I mean, you're reprising my comments from earlier, but this is. I'm grateful for choice because I think it increases the likelihood that more children will get that kind of rich, content-rich education that Hirsch described. And I mean, why am I a Hirsch guy? Because he described. I've said this 1,000 times. He described what I saw in my South Bronx classroom every day. Kids who could decode. You used the word. But who struggled with comprehension because they simply didn't have the same background knowledge, vocabulary, allusions, idiomatic language that others did. And that is, again, did I mention I'm a choice guy? Because I'm a choice guy. But I worry that when we are all choosing our own adventures and choosing our own values-based schools, that's what's going to go missing.
Thank you all for coming. My question is kind of for all of you. In the beginning of your conversation amongst yourselves, you all kind of alluded to a belief that certain types of education in the U.S., especially an approach to history, which you all criticized, leads to a lack of patriotism or even a dislike of the United States. So firstly, I was kind of wondering if you could explain why exactly you think, for example, learning about systemic racism directly leads students to dislike the United States. And furthermore, if you could give any more concrete examples or data aside from, examples of out-of-touch celebrities being out-of-touch celebrities, of a correlation between, say, students who learn about systemic racism in history class and either an increase in dislike of the United States or, more importantly, a disengagement in or a lack of engagement in civics, which I think we would all agree is one of the main aspects of education.
I'll give it as simple answer as possible. I wrote a paper for AI a year ago or more. So I taught civics, I taught history in high school, and I was very proud of the fact that, and I used to say this to my students, if you can tell me a single thing about my politics, then I failed. This is not about, this is not about my views, this is about your. And my class, by the way, was constitutional issues in the news. I wanted them to understand that the Constitution is alive, and there's issues right now. Let's debate them. So, I'm not sure how you netted out on this. I didn't support the critical race theory bans. I never took a public position on it, but had I been asked to, it's like, no, I'm not in favor of banning anything. The word ban is anathema to me. But what I'm adamant about is there should be professional standards in teaching, and it should be the ones I described. Not to put myself on a pedestal, but teachers should not be bringing their priors into the classroom. I come out of a journalism background. It's going missing there too, but I'm old enough to have worked in journalism when we acknowledged that objectivity was a myth, but we pursued it anyway. Right? So that's the professionalism that I'm talking about. In other words, it's understanding, yes, of course, systemic racism is real. Yes, of course, there are things that critical race theorists can teach us. But there's a difference between teaching it and adopting it as orthodoxy. Right. And that's what concerns me.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's more or less where we net it out. It's the application that has been concerning. So I don't think there are many folks out there that are arguing for banning the idea broadly of it being discussed. I mean, I think Robert put that very well. But when you compel teachers or you compel students to profess ideas that violate Title IV and Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1965, or when you are sorting children by race into different, groups, when you're doing privilege walks or, any of the crazy stuff that you hear in the news, that's where the line has to be drawn. It's the application of CRT in schools, which, we've seen occasionally. So I don't know, for me, that's where the line is.
Yeah, and I think in practice, I think the truth is that those things they have happened. That's the problem, is they have happened. Right. And when you say ban CRT, so critical race theory is a theory. So this is where the conversation gets conflated. If I'm teaching U.S. history or I'm teaching about the Constitution, critical race theory doesn't belong in that class, doesn't belong in that conversation. It is an upper level theory that should be discussed with students that are prepared to discuss it as a theory. It's not history. It is a theory, a way of looking at something. And obviously students at this level are ready to prepare to have that conversation and bring different points of view to it. But you're not putting it in a U.S. history class when you're talking about the Constitution. And so that's where we start. That's where I think people start talking past each other, right? Because you're saying, well, you can't put critical race theory in my elementary textbooks. You shouldn't have critical race theory in my elementary text. Those students are, nor are they prepared for that, nor is that the proper topic, right? And so I think if we start having the conversation about, look, it's a theory and it belongs in a discussion of higher ed and one of many theories where you could debate all day about it, that's fine. It's when you impose it on, and I'll go back to something Robert said that I always remember. As a social studies teacher, I stood up there and I remember my goal at the end of the year is, look, I teach what's there. I spark discussion among students and let them debate, reach their own conclusions. It is not my job to determine what their conclusion is, number one. And number two, they shouldn't know my political view. At the end of the school year, they should have no clue. No clue, because where I'm interjecting and when I'm teaching, when I'm getting in there, I'm trying to spark discussion, especially when you're talking about the K-12 level, right? When you're talking about look, there's no disputing what battles took place during the Civil War, right, or during World War II. Those are factual things. You can also have opinions on what led to the end, what really led to the end of World War II, or why the Civil War was fought. But those are discussions that are sparked in the students, right? Mm-hmm. I give you what happened, and you tell me, or you discuss back and forth what you think with the information that you're able to gather, arriving at your own conclusion. And the truth is always complicated, right? The truth is always nuanced and it's always complicated, but that's why those discussions are valid. When you have someone from either side of the spectrum telling a student, especially at that level, what they need to be thinking, that's a problem. And that's beyond critical race theory. That's just in general. We need to get our students to really think and process information, take it in, and have those discussions. That's why I think part of the reason we've lost some of this is great here, because you're able to do it, right? The civil discussion and have disagreement, and nobody gets upset, nobody's mad. We can agree to disagree. That's perfectly fine. That's really what our country is based on, actually. But I think there's nuances there that don't sell papers, right? Well, they don't even print papers anymore, but they don't make headlines, right? They create that animosity whereas if you parse it, right, and you start to talk about it where in the boxes where it belongs, no, we're not banning it. We're saying, hey, this is a conversation that belongs over here at this level, not in this class, and certainly not in this topic. And I think that goes for a lot of the things that we get into these heated arguments over in school content is hey, people say Florida banned book. Well, if there's a book that is not a book that we're going to take off our shelves, because the local school districts do, they don't take it off the shelf, but they say, you know what, it shouldn't be in the K-3 library. Yeah. This book, the reading level and content belongs in the 6-8 library. Yeah. Well, there goes the headline. They banned the book. No, the book was moved to where it should be, and it's accessible. And if a parent wants to sign that book out for their student and they think they're mature enough for it, it's a parent decision. Yeah. But that's where we fall into the trap of these arguments and these labels, which don't necessarily tell the whole truth.
And I'm very fond of pointing out that 2/3 of 17-year-olds cannot read the books we're fighting about. When do we talk about that?
But they're graphic novels.
Right.
So, you know.
Exactly. Accent on graphic.
Right, exactly.
Well, that's a bit of a disappointing note to end on, but I think we might have to call it at that. So thank you again all for coming to this wonderful event. If you'd like to give a round of applause.
Good job.